You're listening to the Savvy Social Podcast, the show for budding entrepreneurs who want to understand the how and the why of social media marketing. I'm your host, Andrea Jones. Let's get started. Hey, welcome back to the Savvy Social Podcast. So today I'm talking all about podcast movement, which happened July 23rd through the 26th. And I'm just going to be honest, I tried recording this podcast at least 3 times right after podcast movement. And I kept getting sick and I had this terrible cold. And I really wanted to get this out there, but I just wasn't feeling my best. So here we are. I am now getting this out there. And I'm so excited because podcast movement was or is the world's largest gathering of podcasters. And I really love the team that runs Podcast Movement. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But first, a little story of how I got to Podcast Movement. So my friend Nicole Holland put Podcast Movement on my radar earlier this year, and timing-wise, it just wasn't going to work out for me to go, even though I wanted to go. So I kind of put it off, and I never got my ticket. But I wanted to start my podcast, and I hadn't started it at that point. So I took the Podcast Movement 28-day challenge. I want to say that was April or May of this year, and I launched June 1st. And that challenge kind of took me through all of the elements of creating a podcast, from the hosting to deciding what kind of podcast it was going to be, whether it's going to be solo episodes or interview style or a story or a dialogue. They took you through how to write show notes, how to create your podcast logo, all of those wonderful things that go into making a podcast. I would have not been able to do it without the guys at Podcast Movement and their 28-day challenge. So highly, highly recommend. But after doing the challenge, I submitted my podcast to be one of the winners. And I almost didn't submit it because I was like, this is probably not, there were some other podcasts in there that were way better than mine. But I'm glad I submitted it because I won. Jared, one of the founders or co-creators of Podcast Movement, sent me an email in June and said, hey, do you want to come to Podcast Movement in July? And at that point, I couldn't say no. It felt very serendipitous, like I was supposed to be there. So I made it work. I made it happen, moved stuff around in my schedule, figured it out. And I'm so excited that I went because starting my podcast gave me such a creative outlet. Blogging doesn't really work for me. It just feels like a chore. And I used to do YouTube videos, which I love. But lately, I've not been really into doing video. I love live video. I do a lot of Facebook videos. But I didn't really have a creative outlet. And podcasting kind of gave me that platform because I love talking. But going to Podcast Movement gave me this sense of belonging and connection. I felt like I found my people, and I hadn't felt that feeling since I went to VidCon back in their first year in 2012. This was back when I was really big on YouTube, or big into YouTube, minor YouTuber at the time, had my own little 5 minutes of fame there. So I went to VidCon as a YouTube nerd. I loved it, and that feeling that I got from going to that first VidCon, I got that same feeling at Podcast Movement. I felt the excitement for being a part of a growing industry and kind of being on the ground floor of all of the exciting things that's happening with podcasting. I really loved being able to talk to people who get it. Like, they understand podcasts, they understand the tech behind it, or they understand the passion and the energy that can come from this medium of, providing content. And so I really loved being in that space and connecting with people. It was so amazing. I got to meet my fellow 28-day challenge winner, Adriana. I'm going to put a link to her podcast in the show notes because if you, her podcast is for Latinx Americans. And if you're looking for something that's in Spanish and in English, and you're looking for something that's empowering for minorities, you definitely want to check out her podcast. But there were so many other people who I met that I made connections I would have never made online. And as magical as the internet is, you can't take away that in-person connection. Now, one of the things I want to chat about on this podcast is what I learned. So what did I learn at Podcast Movement 2018? Some of these things are directly related to podcasts, but a lot of them can be translated into any sort of content creation. The first thing I want to talk about, I actually can't remember who said it, but I wrote down in my notes this key point, which is to ask your podcast audience to subscribe for free. Emphasis on the word free. So don't just say subscribe. Emphasize that it's free. So we're all used to subscribing on YouTube. It's very much the same thing. It is not at all like subscribing to a magazine, because that costs money. Subscribing to a podcast is free. And really, it's following. So similar to following something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, you kind of follow them so that you get the updates. You want to follow or subscribe the podcast so you get updates. So that's my call to action for this video. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. It's free. All right, one of my favorite sessions was the Self-Publishing for Podcasters section by Chandler Bolt. And he taught us how to amplify our content and establish our authority by publishing a book. And his whole thing was to publish the book in the next 90 days, which is intense. But the way he broke it down, it really made sense to me, and I feel empowered and impassioned to start my own book. Based on his session, he suggested to figure out what advice you want to continue to repeat, what advice you always find yourself repeating, and you want to combine that with some common misconceptions that you hear in your industry. So he had us do this brainstorming session, very similar to a brainstorming session that I have inside the Savvy Social School. He had us write out our book ideas, and after writing out those ideas, I definitely feel like I have a book in me. So stay tuned, you guys. But one of his best pieces of advice was to speak the book instead of writing it. So I don't know about you, but as I mentioned, I love talking. I find talking through my thoughts to be way easier than writing it down. It's easier for me to get my message across. So I don't know. We'll see what happens there. I'm definitely inspired because of that session. Another session that inspired me was Claudio Romo Eldman's session on communicating genuine purpose to a distrusting audience. So first of all, Claudia was a very convicting speaker. Her energy was so contagious. And even though English wasn't her first language, I felt like her passion just came through her words, and she had an impact with what she was saying. One of the things I loved is at one point she had us put on these eye masks and listen to the stories that her podcast was sharing. It was really powerful. She has this passion for building a world that is very sustainable and welcoming and not destructive. So from her session, I learned that podcasts are a trusted and intimate space to share your story and your message. So podcasts are equalizers that allow us to get in the emotional narrative of a story. Once we understand an issue, which we most likely do through storytelling, then we're less likely to fear that issue. She talked about how consumers are buying with their heart and how we as consumers expect our favorite brands to kind of take a stand for something. So I really love the impassioned speech that she gave at Podcast Movement. Another panel that I popped into randomly was Joe Harbinger. He was on a panel and he talked about finding interesting places to advertise your podcast, thinking outside of the box, looking for ad space after some podcast episodes instead of before or during. I found that kind of like an interesting spin on things, but that same panel also talked about focusing on getting in front of the right audience and not any not just any old audience. One of the things he said that I disagreed with is that social media is not a great tool for podcasters. So I may have to do a whole thing on social media for podcasts. And I do have a whole thing, which I'll talk about later. But I want to kind of combat that thought a little bit. But some of the thoughts he had that were really interesting, things like finding different places to advertise and making sure to get in front of the right audience, which is definitely what I agree with. So from a data standpoint, all the numbers, one of the sessions that was very interesting to me was Rob's session from Libsyn. He's the founder, I believe, or owner. I personally use Libsyn. It's a hosting company for my podcast. It took me a while to kind of land on Libsyn, but I went with them because they're an industry leader. It's just that simple. There are tons of other hosting companies out there. They're all doing cool things, but Libsyn has this level of clout that I just really appreciate. So Rob from Libsyn shared some very interesting facts with us. I want to just kind of share them with you today because I found them fascinating. So the median podcast, right in the middle, has 145 downloads per episode on average. And he took this data from active podcasts, so podcasts that are still posting episodes. 85% of listeners listen on mobile devices. So, hey, I know you're on the go and you're listening there. 72% of listeners listen via Apple Podcasts or iTunes, which is now Apple Podcasts, which I found so fascinating. So one of the things that I changed recently was my link in my Instagram bio now goes directly to iTunes or Apple Podcasts so that you guys can listen there directly, taking out some of those clicks. He also talked about Spotify. He shared that Spotify is the next in line for where people listen to podcasts. So it's Apple Podcasts and then Spotify. So I'm on Spotify. If you search for the Savvy Social Podcast, you can find it on there. Some cool things they're doing over there to help promote podcasts. Okay, so the last thing he talked about were just some really great quotes about creating content. He said, word of mouth marketing is still the number one way to market. And I totally agree, 100%. Nothing is better than a personal recommendation from someone you trust. Rob also said, don't worry about the length of your podcast. There's no such thing as too long, just too boring. Ouchie. Love that one. It's a hard-hitting one. And that idea can be applied to so many different types of content, whether it's video or social media posts or web content. Focus on providing value and don't worry too much about the length of your content. All right, so like I said, I had such a great time at Podcast Movement. I loved it. And because of that, I was able to launch my new branch of the business, which is called socialmediaforpodcasts.com. It's kind of a fun little direction that I'm going. I was looking at my client roster earlier this year, and 5 of my 28 clients are podcasts. So it was a really easy choice to kind of niche down into this little subsection of the internet. I'm finding this really passionate space where I can share my thoughts. And so I really love working with podcasts, and I love having my own podcast. So if you're looking for podcast help, head on over to the website, which is socialmediaforpodcasts.com. I'm also on Instagram, Social Media for Podcasts. I'm on Twitter and Facebook as well. But head on over there, check things out. I'm so excited to be there. And I'm so excited to be back from Podcast Movement. It feels like a million years ago. But it was such a great experience, and I'm hoping that my schedule allows me to go next year because I would really love to do that, learn more about podcasts, connect with the industry, improve my own podcast, and meet some of you lovely, lovely people. All right, that's all for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening. The best way to connect with me is inside of our free Facebook group. You can just head on over to Facebook and search Savvy Social Crew, or you can use the URL savvysocialcrew.com. I'm hanging out there all the time, all day, every day. I'd love to connect with you and chat. That is all for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.